Hey guys, welcome back to Sleep into Power. I am NJ, and tonight we're traveling back more than 2,500 years to discover the remarkable rise and fall of Sparta. Wherever you are in the world right now, whatever the hour happens to be on your side of the planet, I am glad you found your way here. Some of you are listening as the evening is only just beginning to settle, with the light still going out of the sky behind your curtains. Some of you are much further into the night than that, in a quiet house, in a quiet street, with everyone else already asleep. And some of you have woken at 3 in the morning, for no reason you can name, and you have reached for something gentle to carry you back down. Whichever of those you happen to be tonight, you are very welcome here, and there is nothing at all you need to do from this point onwards, except stay exactly where you are. To those of you who come back to this channel night after night, thank you, truly. A great many of you have been listening for a long time now, and I know that for some of you, these documentaries have become part of how the day ends. That means a lot more to me than I can easily put into words. And if this is your first night here, then welcome. You have arrived at a good one. There is nothing you need to catch up on, and nothing you need to remember. You can let the story wash over you, and if you fall asleep in the first 10 minutes and never hear the end of it, that is not a failure. That is the entire point. Tonight we are going somewhere very specific. A narrow valley in the southern Peloponnese, in Greece, walled in on both sides by mountains, with a river running down the middle of it. In that valley, across roughly 1,000 years, a small city produced a society so strange, so severe, and so completely unlike anything else in the ancient world that people are still arguing about it today. We are going to walk through the whole of it. The Bronze Age world that came before, the shadowy lawgiver who may or may not have existed, the boys taken from their homes at 7 years old, the women who scandalized the rest of Greece simply by owning land and speaking their minds, the bronze wall of the phalanx, the pass at Thermopylae, the long, slow victory that ruined them, and the strange afterlife of a city that became a tourist attraction for wealthy Romans who wanted to watch boys being whipped. We will take it slowly. There is no hurry in any of this. Everyone in this story has been dead for a very long time, and none of them mind if you drift off before the end. So get comfortable. Turn the lights down if they are not down already. Let your shoulders come away from your ears. Let the pillow take the weight of your head properly, rather than half taking it. If your jaw is tight, let it loosen. You have nowhere to be. Before we begin properly, 2 quick things. The first is that a brand new channel is launching soon, called Meditate into Power. It will be guided sleep meditations, visualizations, and long relaxing sleep journeys, made in the same way and with the same care as these documentaries. If that sounds like something you would want, keep an eye out for it over the coming weeks. The second is simply that if you enjoy relaxing history documentaries like this one, subscribing genuinely helps. And if you enjoy this documentary, you'll also find my book linked below, along with Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Buy Me a Coffee, and all of the other ways you can support Sleep into Power. Every bit of support genuinely helps this channel continue creating these documentaries. That is all of that. Now let it go, and let us begin. Close your eyes. It is early morning, more than 3,000 years ago, and you are standing in a valley in the south of Greece. The first thing you notice is the mountain. It rises to the west of you, enormous and close, so close that it seems to lean over the valley floor rather than stand beside it. Its name will be Taygetus. Its ridgeline runs north and south for something like 100 kilometers, gray and pink in this light, with snow still lying in the high folds even now, in the warm part of the year. The sun is coming up behind you, over the lower mountains on the eastern side, and the light is moving down the face of Taygetus very slowly, in a long line, the way water moves down a wall. Below you, the valley floor is still in shadow. It is perhaps 10 or 12 kilometers wide here, flat, green, threaded with the pale line of a river. That river is the Eurotas. It runs the whole length of the valley, north to south, down towards the sea. You can hear it faintly from where you stand, a low, continuous sound underneath the birds. There is no city here, not yet. There will not be a city here for several hundred years. What there is, instead, is a scatter of settlements. Smoke rising thinly from a hillside to the south. A track worn into the grass. Somewhere out of sight, the sound of goats. This is Laconia, in the Bronze Age, and the world it belongs to is the world of the Mycenaeans. We call them Mycenaeans after the great citadel at Mycenae, up in the northeastern Peloponnese, but they were spread across the whole of southern Greece. They built palaces on hilltops, with thick walls of stone so large that later Greeks could not believe human beings had lifted them, and decided the Cyclopes must have done it. They traded across the eastern Mediterranean, in copper and tin and olive oil, and perfumed unguents. They buried their dead with gold, and they kept records, on clay tablets, in a script we call Linear B, which is an early form of Greek, written in syllables rather than letters. For a long time, historians were not entirely sure how important Laconia had been in that world. There was a site on a ridge above the Eurotas, known as the Menelaean, which had clearly been a substantial Mycenaean settlement. There was a magnificent tomb at Vaphio, a few miles south, which produced 2 gold cups so beautiful that they are among the most famous objects to survive from Bronze Age Greece. But there was no palace, no obvious center, and then, quite recently, they found one, at a place called Agios Vasilios, in the southern part of the valley. Excavations that began in the early 21st century uncovered a large Mycenaean administrative complex. Fresco fragments, bronze swords, and crucially, Linear B tablets, which means bureaucracy, which means a palace, which means that this quiet valley was once a place that counted things, and taxed things, and wrote them down. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something about how this whole story works. For over a century, the standard picture was that Bronze Age Laconia was a bit of a backwater. Then somebody dug in the right field. The ground here has not finished talking. A good deal of what I am about to tell you tonight is genuinely well established, and a good deal of it rests on nothing more than one ancient author writing several centuries after the fact, and it matters that you can tell which is which. I will try to keep flagging it as we go. But that palace, whatever it was called and whoever ran it, did not last. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, the Mycenaean world came apart. Not just in Laconia, everywhere. Palace after palace burned or was abandoned. Pylos burned. Mycenae itself declined. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the same thing was happening to other civilizations at roughly the same time, and the Hittite Empire in Anatolia disappeared altogether. Why is one of the great open questions of ancient history. Some point to the mysterious raiders the Egyptians recorded as the Sea Peoples. Some point to a long drought, which core samples and pollen records do seem to support. Some point to earthquakes. Some argue for internal collapse, that these palace economies were fragile things, over-specialized and over-centralized, and that once one part of the network failed, the rest went with it, the way a power grid fails. Most likely it was several of those at once. We cannot know for certain, and anyone who tells you they can is going further than the evidence allows. Just let that settle for a moment. The end of a world, and nobody living through it, able to see the whole shape of it. Let your breathing slow a little. There is no need to hold on to any of these names. They will still be here. What followed is what used to be called the Greek Dark Ages, roughly from 1100 to 800, before the Common Era. Population fell, settlements shrank. The great buildings stopped, pottery became plainer, and Linear B simply vanished. Greece forgot how to write, and stayed illiterate for something like 400 years, which is one of the strangest facts in European history. That name, Dark Ages, has softened in recent scholarship. Excavations at Lefkandi, on the island of Euboea, turned up an enormous building from around the 10th century. with rich burials inside it, including a woman covered in gold and a man whose ashes were wrapped in cloth. Whatever else those centuries were, they were not empty. But in Laconia specifically, the archaeology does thin out badly, and the valley seems to have become a much quieter place. And it is into that quiet that the Dorians are supposed to have come. The Greeks themselves had a story about this. They called it the return of the Heraclidae, the return of the sons of Heracles. In the story, the descendants of Heracles had a rightful claim to the Peloponnese, and after generations in exile they came back with a Dorian army, swept down through the mountains, divided the land between them by lot, and one of those lots was Laconia. You should hold that story loosely. The linguistic evidence behind it is real. The Greek spoken in Sparta and across much of the southern Peloponnese, Crete and the southwestern coast of Asia Minor, was a distinct dialect, Doric, noticeably different from the Ionic of Athens. Something moved people around, but the archaeology has stubbornly refused to produce the invasion. There is no destruction layer that fits, no clear line of burned settlements marking an army's path, no sudden new material culture arriving all at once. Many historians now think that what actually happened was slower and messier, a long drift of populations into a depopulated landscape over generations, which the Greeks later tidied into a single heroic conquest because that is what stories do to history. Either way, by around the 9th or 8th century before the Common Era, there were 4 small villages sitting together on the western bank of the Eurotas, in the shadow of Taygetus: Pitana, Messoa, Limnae, Kynosura. They were not walled. They were not grand. Nobody looking at them would have picked them out. Together, they were about to become Sparta. The sun has fully cleared the eastern ridge now, in this imagined morning of ours, and the light has reached the valley floor. The olive trees are catching it, that particular gray-green that olive leaves turn when the sun is low and hitting them from the side. The river is running. The mountain is standing where it has always stood. Nothing here looks like the beginning of anything. Let us stay in the valley, and let the centuries move. By the 8th century before the Common Era, those 4 villages had grown together into something recognizably a city, and they had absorbed a 5th community, Amyclae, a few kilometers to the south, which had its own ancient sanctuary and its own older identity. And even then, even once it was a city, Sparta did not build itself a wall. That refusal lasted for centuries, and the Spartans made it into a boast. Their walls, they said, were their men. It is the kind of line that sounds like propaganda, and it partly was, but it was also perfectly true for a very long time, and it left the archaeologists of the modern world with almost nothing to dig. The Athenian historian Thucydides saw this coming with remarkable clarity. Writing in the 5th century, he observed that if Sparta were ever deserted, and only its temples and foundations remained, people in the distant future would find it very hard to believe that this place had been as powerful as the stories claimed. Athens, he said, would look twice as impressive as it really was. Sparta would look half. He was right. Go to Sparta today, and there is remarkably little to see, and what there is has to be worked for. So much of what follows tonight comes to us through words rather than stones, and the words come mostly from outsiders, and often from admirers or enemies. Keep that in the back of your mind as we go. Now, how did this place come to be what it was? The Spartans themselves would have started with the gods, and with the mountain. In the myth, Taygetus was a nymph, a daughter of Atlas, pursued by Zeus. Her son was Lacedaemon, who married a woman named Sparta, the daughter of the local river god Eurotas, and between them they gave their names to the land and to the city. That is why you will find the Spartans called Lacedaemonians in ancient texts, and why their shields carried a single letter, lambda, standing for Lacedaemon. I like that particular myth because of what it is doing. It marries the mountain to the river. It makes the geography itself the parent of the people. And when you stand in that valley, with those two things dominating everything you can see, You understand exactly why they told it that way. But the story the Spartans told about how their society came to be, as opposed to how their land came to be, centers on one man, Lycurgus. And here we have to be careful, because Lycurgus is one of the great question marks of ancient history. According to tradition, he was a member of the royal house who acted as regent, traveled abroad, studied the laws of Crete and Egypt and elsewhere, consulted the oracle at Delphi, and came home with a complete constitution which he persuaded or compelled the Spartans to adopt. Having done so, the story goes, he made them swear to keep his laws until he returned, and then left Sparta and never came back. Some versions saying he starved himself to death so that the oath could never expire. It is a wonderful story. Plutarch, who wrote the fullest account of Lycurgus that survives, opened it with a sentence that every historian since has had to reckon with. He said that concerning Lycurgus, nothing whatsoever can be said which is not disputed. Different authorities gave different dates, different parentage, different achievements. Plutarch was writing around 700 years after Lycurgus supposedly lived, and he was already looking back through a fog. Modern historians are divided. Some think there was a real reformer somewhere behind the legend. Some think Lycurgus was a god or a hero who was later demoted into a man, and note that there was a shrine to him in Sparta, and that Herodotus records the Delphic oracle, appearing uncertain whether to address him as human or divine. Most now think that the Spartan system was not designed by anyone, that it grew, over generations, in response to a very particular set of pressures, and that the Spartans later did what people often do with institutions, whose origins they have forgotten. They gave them a founder. So when I say Lycurgus from here on, take it as shorthand. Not a man we can shake hands with, but a name attached to a body of law. And what law it was? The foundation document, or what was remembered as the foundation document, was called the Great Retra. Retra means something like a saying or a pronouncement. We have it because Plutarch quoted it, in language that is genuinely archaic and awkward, which is one of the reasons many scholars think it preserves something authentically old. It was framed as an instruction from Delphi. It ordered the founding of a sanctuary of Zeus and Athena, the organization of the people into tribes and divisions, the establishment of a council of 30 including the kings, and regular assemblies to be held between two landmarks, called Babica and Knakion. And it said that the people should have the power of decision. Then, attached to the end, there is a rider, a later addition, attributed to two kings named Polydorus and Theopompus, stating that if the people should choose crookedly, the elders and the kings could set the decision aside. Sit with that for a second. It is a small piece of text, and inside it you can watch a democracy being closed. First, the people get the final word. Then, in a clause bolted on afterwards, the people get the final word unless their betters disagree with it. That tension runs through the entire history of Sparta. Let your breath out slowly. Let the shoulders drop again. These are old arguments, and they were settled a long time ago. The structure that emerged had 4 moving parts, and it was unlike anything else in Greece. At the top there were 2 kings, not 1, 2, ruling simultaneously from 2 separate royal houses, the Agiads and the Eurypontids, both claiming descent from Heracles, both hereditary, side by side, for centuries. No other Greek state did this. Nobody has ever fully explained why Sparta did, though the most common suggestion is that it fossilized some ancient arrangement between 2 communities that merged in the distant past. The kings led the armies, and in the field a Spartan king had enormous authority. They held major priesthoods and were the state's channel to the gods. They received a double portion at public meals, and the hides of sacrificed animals, and when one of them died, the mourning was extraordinary, with representatives from across Laconia required to attend and wail. But at home, in peacetime, their power was closely fenced, and the fence had 2 parts. The first was the Gerousia, the Council of Elders. 28 men over the age of 60, plus the 2 kings, making 30. They served for life. They prepared the business that went before the assembly, and they sat as the supreme criminal court, which meant they could try a king. Election to the Gerousia was a matter of enormous prestige, the crown of a Spartan life, and the method of election was this. The candidates walked through the assembly in turn, and the assembly shouted, and men shut in a nearby building, with no view of proceedings, judged which shout had been loudest. Aristotle, reviewing this system in the Politics, called it childish. The second fence was the ephors, 5 of them, elected annually from the ordinary citizen body, and by the classical period, they had become genuinely formidable. They presided over the assembly, they handled foreign envoys, they could fine and imprison, and they could arrest a king and bring him to trial. 2 of them accompanied the king on campaign. Every month, the kings and the ephors exchanged oaths, the kings swearing to rule according to the laws, the ephors swearing to keep the kingship secure if they did. And each year, on entering office, the ephors formally declared war on the helots, the enslaved population who worked the land. We will come back to the helots at length, because you cannot understand Sparta without them, but hold that detail, because it is the single most revealing thing in the whole constitution. A state that renews its declaration of war on its own workforce, annually, as a matter of routine administration, is a state that has understood something frightening about itself. Underneath all of this sat the assembly of citizens, which met in the open air, and which decided by shouting rather than counting. Later Greeks and Romans looked at this arrangement and were deeply impressed. The historian Polybius admired it as a mixed constitution, monarchy, and aristocracy and democracy balanced against each other, so that no single element could run away with the state. Plato and Xenophon admired it for other reasons. Aristotle, who looked harder than most, admired parts of it and thought other parts were badly designed, and made some criticisms about property and population that were going to turn out to be devastatingly accurate. What none of them disputed was that it was stable. For something close to 3 centuries, while the rest of the Greek world convulsed with revolutions and tyrannies and civil wars, Sparta did not. That stability was the thing everybody wanted to explain. And the answer, or at least the part of the answer that fascinated everyone, was not really in the constitution at all. It was in what Sparta did to its children. But before any of that could matter, Sparta had to become the thing that needed it. And that happened across the mountain. Look west from the city, at the wall of Taygetus. On the far side of it, invisible from here, is Messenia. It is the best land in the southern Peloponnese. Well-watered, wide, gentler than Laconia, with a long, fertile plain and a coast. Somewhere in the 8th century before the Common Era, Sparta went over the mountains and took it. The First Messenian War, in the traditional dating, ran for around 20 years in the later 8th century. What we know of it is thin, and comes mostly through much later writers, but the outcome is not in doubt. Messenia was annexed, and the Messenians, a Greek people speaking Greek and worshipping the same gods, were reduced to working their own land for Spartan owners. Roughly 2 generations later, they rose. The Second Messenian War, in the early to middle 7th century, was very nearly the end of Sparta. And here we have something precious, because for once we have a contemporary voice. The poet Tyrtaeus was writing during that war, in Sparta, for Spartans, and fragments of his elegies survive. They are exhortations, written to be recited to men who were frightened, and they tell you the mood of a state fighting for its existence. He describes the conquered Messenians of the previous generation, laboring like donkeys under enormous burdens, compelled to hand over half of everything their fields produced, and to come and mourn at the funerals of their masters. That is Sparta before the Spartan system, a fairly ordinary Greek city that had bitten off an entire neighboring people, and then discovered what it had done. There is a later legend attached to that war, of a Messenian hero called Aristomenes, who performed impossible feats and was thrown into a chasm and survived by following a fox out through a crack in the rock. It is a wonderful story, and it comes to us through Pausanias, writing something like 800 years afterwards, drawing on a poem written 5 centuries after the events. Enjoy it. Do not lean on it. What matters is what Sparta became once it had won. And this is the single most important reversal in the whole subject. So let it settle properly. We tend to assume that Sparta conquered Messenia because Sparta was militaristic. Most historians now think it is the other way round. Sparta became militaristic because it had conquered Messenia. Consider the position. You have taken permanent possession of a large, fertile territory on the wrong side of a mountain range, inhabited by a people who have not gone anywhere, who remember perfectly well that they are Messenians, who vastly outnumber you, and who have already risen once and nearly finished you. You cannot let them go, because your entire food supply now depends on them. You cannot integrate them, because there are far too many, and you cannot police them with a part-time militia of farmers, which is what every other Greek state had. So you build something else, a permanent army that never stands down, a society in which every citizen is a professional soldier from 7 years old, freed from all other work because the conquered do the work, a system that removes anything, wealth, comfort, private life, that might soften the grip or split the citizens against each other, and an ideology of absolute equality among the holders, because a garrison that quarrels internally is a garrison that dies. Everything strange about Sparta stops being strange the moment you accept that it was an occupation that lasted 300 years. You can even see the change in the ground. Laconian workshops in the 7th and early 6th centuries were producing beautiful things, decorated pottery exported all round the Mediterranean, ivories, and bronze work of the very highest quality. Then, over the course of the 6th century, that production thins out and largely stops. The archaeologists can watch a society going quiet. The old view was that a law was passed. The better view is that a whole set of priorities shifted, and that the market for luxury inside Sparta simply closed. By the middle of the 6th century, Sparta had also learned the limits of conquest. It attacked Arcadia to the north, and was badly beaten by the little city of Tegea. And Herodotus tells a lovely story about the Spartans consulting Delphi, being told to bring home the bones of the hero Orestes, and finding them in a blacksmith's yard. Whatever they actually did, the policy changed. Sparta stopped annexing and started allying. Tegea became a partner rather than a possession, and out of that grew the network of alliances across the Peloponnese that made Sparta the leading power in Greece. So by the year 500 before the Common Era, the picture is complete. 2 kings, 28 elders, 5 ephors, an assembly that shouts, a citizen body of professional soldiers, a subject population of free craftsmen and traders who have no vote, and beneath everything, on both sides of the mountain, a mass of enslaved farmers holding the whole structure up. Out in the valley the light has moved on. It is the middle of the morning now. The Eurotas is running low and clear, the way it does in the dry months. Somewhere along its bank there is a boy of 6, who has 1 more year at home with his mother, and does not yet know what is coming. Let us go and meet him. Before we follow him, we have to deal with the story about what happened to Spartan babies, because it is probably the single most repeated fact about Sparta, and it is a great deal shakier than its fame suggests. Plutarch tells us that a Spartan father did not decide whether to raise his own child. The infant was carried to a place where the elders of the tribe examined it, and if it was well made and sturdy, they ordered it reared and assigned it one of the 9,000 allotments of land. If it was weak or deformed, they sent it to a place called the Apothetai, a chasm at the foot of Taygetus, on the reasoning that it was better neither for the child nor for the state that it should live. That is the story. Now here is the problem with it. Plutarch was writing around 7 centuries after the period he is describing. Herodotus does not mention it. Thucydides does not mention it. Xenophon, who lived in Sparta, sent his own sons through the Spartan upbringing and wrote an entire admiring treatise on Spartan institutions, does not mention it, which is remarkable if it were a routine part of Spartan life. In the early 21st century, a team of Greek researchers examined skeletal remains recovered from the chasm at Kyadus, which had long been associated with the story, and found the bones of adolescents and adults, mostly male, and no infants at all. None of that proves it never happened. Exposure of unwanted infants was practiced in various forms across the ancient Greek world, and in Athens too, and it was usually a family decision rather than a state one. What the evidence does suggest is that the specifically Spartan version, the Committee of Elders, the official inspection, the cliff, may well belong to the legend of Sparta rather than to the history of it. Later writers were building a portrait of the most ruthlessly efficient society imaginable, and the story fits that portrait beautifully, which is exactly why you should be suspicious of it. So, our boy is 7, and he is alive, and he is about to be taken away. There was an official in charge of this, drawn from the most senior ranks, whose title was the paidonymos, the boy herder. Under him, the boys were sorted by age into packs, and each pack was led by one of the older youths, who had the authority to give orders and to punish. Any adult citizen who happened to be passing could correct any boy at any time, and if a boy complained to his father about it, his father was expected to punish him again. Understand what that does. It dissolves the household. There is no private authority left, no separate loyalty, nowhere to appeal. The whole city becomes one long, unbroken chain of command, reaching down to a 7-year-old. They slept in barracks. On beds they made themselves from reeds pulled by hand from the banks of the Eurotas, without knives, because knives would have made it easy. In winter they were allowed to mix in thistledown for a little warmth. They went barefoot all year. The reasoning, according to Xenophon, was practical rather than cruel. Bare feet make for tougher feet, and tough feet climb better and run better and are less dependent on supply. From the age of 12 they were given one cloak for the entire year, one garment for summer heat and winter frost alike, so that the body learned to manage temperature on its own, and they were kept hungry, deliberately. Not starved, but always somewhat short, on the argument that a hungry body stays lean and grows tall, and that a man who is used to hunger will not be broken by a siege. But the hunger had a second purpose, and this is where the system becomes genuinely strange. The boys were expected to make up the shortfall by stealing, from the storerooms, from the messes, from the fields. Stealing was not merely tolerated, it was required. What was punished, and punished severely, was being caught, because being caught meant you had done it badly. Out of that comes the most famous anecdote in the whole of Spartan literature. A boy stole a fox cub and hid it under his cloak, and when he was questioned, he stood perfectly still and let the animal tear open his stomach rather than give himself away, and he died on his feet without making a sound. You will find that story everywhere. It comes from Plutarch. It has all the marks of a teaching tale, the kind of thing told to boys in order to produce boys who would do it, rather than a report of something that occurred. Whether or not any actual child ever died with a fox under his cloak, the story tells you precisely what the system was aiming at, and that is worth more than the fact would have been. Let your breathing settle for a moment here, because this next part is the part almost nobody expects. They sang. Sparta in the 7th century before the Common Era was one of the great musical centers of the Greek world. Poets came from abroad to work there. Terpander of Lesbos, credited with reshaping Greek lyric music, was said to have been summoned to Sparta by the oracle. Alcman, whose surviving fragments include some of the loveliest lines in early Greek poetry, wrote there, and what he wrote were choral songs for choirs of girls. Tyrtaeus, the war poet, wrote elegies that Spartan armies sang on the march for centuries afterwards. The boys learned all of it. Poetry by heart, choral singing in parts, dancing in formation. There were great festivals built entirely around choruses, one of them, the Gymnopediae, filling days of the summer with dancing in the heat of the open square. And this was not softness bolted onto the side of the training. It was the training. A choir is a phalanx that makes a sound. Hundreds of men holding a line, moving as one body, each one subordinating himself to a rhythm outside of himself. Nobody rushing, nobody breaking. If you can teach a boy to hold his part in a chorus of 200 voices, you have taught him most of what he needs to hold his place in a line of 200 shields. They were also taught how to speak, which meant being taught how not to. Long speech was discouraged. The prize style was short, dry, exact, and often faintly amusing, and it worked so well as a reputation that we still use their name for it. Laconic, from Laconia, a manner of speech so characteristic of one small valley that it became a word in languages that would not exist for another 2,000 years. Then there was the hunting, out on the slopes of Taygetus with dogs, in country steep enough to break an ankle. There was the wrestling, and the running, and the throwing. There was the endless competition, the packs set against each other, ritual fights on an island in the river, and underneath it all there was the bond, which the Spartans regarded as the point of the whole thing. Each youth was attached to an older man who acted as mentor, sponsor, and model, who was held publicly accountable for the boy's conduct, and who in some cases was fined for the boy's failures. This relationship, in Sparta as in several other Greek cities, could have an erotic dimension, and ancient sources disagree, sometimes heatedly, about how far that went and whether it was supposed to. Xenophon insists that in Sparta it was strictly non-physical, and that Lycurgus forbade anything else. Other writers were less convinced. What is not in doubt is that the institution existed, that it was formal, and that it was designed to bind every young man to an adult who was not his father, and to the city through him. Now the darker thing. There was an institution called the Crypteia, the hidden thing. Selected young men were sent out into the countryside, alone or in small groups, carrying only a dagger and whatever food they could get. By day they hid, by night they went out onto the roads and among the estates, and killed helots. Our main account comes from Plutarch, who says he is drawing on Aristotle. Plato mentions it too, describing it as an endurance exercise, a winter of living rough. Historians argue about which of those it primarily was: a state terror program, a survival ordeal, an initiation rite, or all three at once, and about how many people actually died. What is much harder to argue away is the underlying logic, and that logic is the same logic as the annual declaration of war. The most feared army in Greece was, at bottom, an occupying force, and it never stopped behaving like one. Finally, there was the altar. At the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, by the river, there was a ritual in which boys tried to snatch cheeses from the altar, while others stood over it with whips and tried to stop them. In the classical period, this seems to have been what it sounds like: a rough, competitive rite of passage attached to an old and slightly wild goddess. What happened to it later is one of the strangest things in this entire story, and we will come back to it, because by the time the Romans arrived, it had turned into something else altogether. At 20, if he had come through all of this, our boy left the packs. He was elected, or not elected, into one of the common mess groups. He grew his hair long, which Spartan men did as a mark of free adult status. He entered the army. At 30, he became a full citizen. He could vote in the assembly, hold office, live at home with his wife, rather than visiting her in secret. He had spent 23 years being made, and now he was made. And the word for what he had become was homoios, which means one of the similars, one of the equals, one of the alike. That word is going to matter enormously later on, because the day came when the equals stopped being equal, and when that happened, everything else went with it. Let your eyes rest, let the jaw soften. The training is over, and the sun is going down over Taygetus. Now let us look at what the rest of the day was actually like. Walk into Sparta in the 5th century before the Common Era, and your first reaction, if you had come from Athens or Corinth, would probably be mild disappointment. There is no great circuit of walls. There is no marble skyline. There are 5 villages, loosely joined, spread along the western bank of the Eurotas, with open ground and trees between them, more like a large scattered settlement than a city. The public buildings are plain. The houses are plainer. There was a tradition, attributed of course to Lycurgus, that the ceiling of every house had to be finished with nothing but an axe, and the doors with nothing but a saw. No fine joinery, no decoration, nothing that invited display. Whether or not any such law was ever written, the effect it describes was real. Visitors consistently remarked on how modest Spartan private life looked. The money helped enforce that. Sparta refused, for centuries, to mint the silver coinage that the rest of the Greek world was busily adopting. What they used instead were iron spits, heavy, awkward, worth very little for their weight, and reportedly treated with vinegar during manufacture, so that the iron was brittle and useless for anything else. To hold any serious amount of wealth in that currency, you would need a room to keep it in, and a cart to move it. It was, in effect, a deliberately terrible technology, and it was terrible on purpose. It made large-scale trade impractical. It made bribery cumbersome and conspicuous, and it made accumulating a fortune quietly almost impossible. Almost. Not entirely. Hold that thought too. Now the smell of the evening meal. Every adult Spartan citizen belonged to a common mess, a group of perhaps 15 men who ate together every night for their entire adult lives. You did not choose your mess freely, and your mess had to accept you unanimously. And crucially, every member had to contribute a fixed monthly amount from his land: barley meal, wine, cheese, figs, a small sum for relish. If you could not pay, you were out. And if you were out of the mess, you were out of the citizen body. You lost your status, and you became one of the inferiors, and there was no route back. That single rule is the trapdoor underneath the whole Spartan system, and in about 300 years it is going to swallow the state whole. But on this particular evening, nobody is thinking about that. They are thinking about dinner. The famous dish was the black broth, pork, boiled with blood, vinegar and salt. Every Greek who did not have to eat it found it hilarious. There is a story of a man from Sybaris, a city legendary for luxury, who tasted it and said he now understood why Spartans were not afraid to die. In truth, the diet was not as grim as the joke suggests. There was bread, cheese, olives, figs, wine mixed with water, and there was game, because men who hunted well brought back what they killed and shared it, and there were offerings from sacrifices. But the broth was the staple and the symbol, and the point of a shared meal every night for 50 years was not the food, it was the 50 years. These were the men you would stand beside in the line. You ate with them before you ever fought with them. Outside the messes, the city ran on people who were not citizens at all. There were the perioikoi, whose name means the dwellers around. They lived in dozens of communities scattered across Laconia and, later, Messenia. They were free, they managed their own local affairs, but they had no vote in Sparta and no say in Spartan foreign policy. And when Sparta went to war, they marched, and they made everything. The Spartiate citizen was forbidden a trade, so somebody had to do the work, and the perioikoi were the ones who did it. They mined the iron out of the eastern hills. They forged the weapons, they wove the cloaks, they built the ships, they ran what trade there was. Historians increasingly emphasize that without the perioikoi, the Spartan military machine could not have existed for a single season, and yet they left almost no voice of their own in the record. And then there were the helots. The Helots were the enslaved agricultural population, and they were not owned by individuals in the way that a slave in Athens was owned. They belonged to the state and were tied to the land, and were assigned to the estates that supported individual citizens. They farmed the allotments. They handed over a fixed portion of what they grew, which meant that a Spartan citizen could spend his entire life training for war, while his food arrived from fields he never worked. There were two populations of them: the Laconian Helots in the home valley, and the Messenians on the far side of Taygetus, an entire Greek people, conquered in two long wars in the 8th and 7th centuries, who never stopped regarding themselves as Messenians, and who never stopped waiting. We do not have reliable numbers, and you should treat any figure you hear with real caution. Herodotus, describing the army at Plataea, gives 7 Helots to every Spartiate, which, if taken at face value, would mean tens of thousands of them. Modern estimates vary widely, but every ancient writer who discusses Sparta agrees on the essential point, which is that the enslaved vastly outnumbered the free, and that the free knew it every single day of their lives. The measures that followed from that were ugly. The annual declaration of war, which meant a Helot could be killed without the killer incurring religious pollution. The Cryptia. Thucydides records an episode during the Peloponnesian War, in which the Spartans invited Helots, who claimed to have served bravest in battle, to come forward for their freedom, garlanded around 2,000 of them, led them around the temples in celebration, and then, in his words, made them disappear, and nobody ever learned how each of them died. Even allowing for Athenian hostility in the telling, it is one of the coldest passages in Greek historical writing, and its logic is horribly clear. The ones brave enough to claim distinction were the ones dangerous enough to remove. Against all of that, the religious calendar ran on, and it ran constantly. Sparta was among the most devout states in Greece, and the most inconveniently so. Festivals could not be moved. The Carnea, in honor of Apollo, fell in late summer, and during it the army did not march, which is why the force at Thermopylae was as small as it was, a detail we will return to. The Hyacinthia, at the old sanctuary at Amyclae, ran for days, with mourning first and then celebration, and it emptied the city of adults. The Gymnopediae filled the square with dancing. Before a battle they sacrificed. On the march they sacrificed. At the border they sacrificed again, and if the omens were wrong, they turned around and went home, and the rest of Greece found this maddening, and it happened more than once, at moments of real strategic consequence. Let me take you through some of it, because the festivals are where Sparta was at its least severe and its most beautiful, and they are almost never described. The greatest of them was the Hyacinthia, held at the old sanctuary at Amyclae, a few kilometers south of the city, on ground that had been sacred long before the Spartans arrived. The story behind it is one of the saddest in Greek myth. Hyacinthus was a beautiful young man of Amyclae, loved by Apollo, and while the two of them were throwing the discus struck him and killed him, and from his blood came the flower that bears his name. The Spartans built their greatest sanctuary over his tomb and put Apollo on top of it. What stood there is worth trying to picture. Pausanias describes a colossal bronze figure of Apollo, plain and stiff and very old, more like a pillar with a face and hands than a statue, perhaps 13 or 14 meters high, and around its base, a vast throne, made by a craftsman brought in from Asia Minor, covered in carved scenes from myth on every surface. Underneath the throne was the tomb. Nothing of it survives above ground. The site has been located and dug, and there are foundations and votive fragments, and that is all. But it stood for centuries, out on the plain, visible from a long way off, the one grand thing this city ever built, and it was built over a grave. The festival itself ran for 3 days, and it did something psychologically remarkable. The first day was mourning. No garlands, no bread, no singing of hymns to Apollo, a subdued meal, quiet. Then it turned. The following days were given over to celebration, boys playing the lyre and singing, choruses, horse races, girls carried in decorated wicker carriages, processions, and a great communal meal, to which citizens brought their friends and even their household slaves. Grief first, then joy, deliberately, in that order, every year, as a piece of civic machinery. Whatever else you think about the Spartans, they had noticed something true about how human beings actually recover from things. Then there was the Carneia, in the late summer, in honor of Apollo Carneus, the festival that kept the army at home while the Persians came down through Thessaly. It lasted 9 days. Men ate in temporary shelters, 9 to a shelter, in messes, under canvas, which is to say that the whole city spent 9 days pretending to be an army camp. And there was a foot race in which a man carrying woolen fillets ran ahead, and a group of young men chased him, and if they caught him, it was reckoned a good sign for the city. And there was the Gymnopediae, in the hottest part of the summer, in the open square, in the middle of the day, choruses of boys and of grown men, dancing unclothed in the full heat of a Laconian July, for days on end, while the citizens sat and watched. It was partly a display of endurance, and partly a genuine competition, and partly simply a festival, and it was famous throughout Greece. That is the festival the messenger from Leuctra walked into. Down by the river, there was the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, and here, unusually, the archaeology is rich. When British archaeologists dug the site at the beginning of the 20th century, they recovered something like 100,000 tiny votive figures made of lead, cast in molds and offered by ordinary people over centuries. Little warriors, little goddesses, little animals and wreaths. They also found masks, terracotta faces, some of them warriors, some of them old women, some of them grotesque and comic, with sagging cheeks and enormous grinning mouths. They appear to have been worn in dances at the sanctuary, and they are so unexpected that they permanently changed how historians think about this place. Somewhere in the Spartan calendar there was a night when people put on funny faces and danced by the river, and a little way out of town, up on the ridge above the Eurotas, on the same spur where the Bronze Age settlement had stood, there was a shrine to Helen and Menelaus, not as characters in a poem, as local dead, powerful and present, receiving offerings. Girls came and prayed to Helen for beauty, and a bronze offering with her name scratched on it has been dug out of that hillside. Even the government was run on omens. Plutarch reports that every 8 years the ephors would choose a clear moonless night and sit in silence watching the sky, and if they saw a star shoot across it, they took it as a sign that the kings had offended the gods, and the kings were suspended from office until word could be fetched from Delphi. Think about that as a constitutional provision. The head of state can be removed by a meteor. So walk through the middle of the day now, before the light goes. The heat comes off the ground. There is dust in the air, fine and pale, kicked up by feet and by animals, hanging in the shafts of sun between the trees. There is the smell of it, dry earth and crushed herbs and animal dung and wood smoke, and under that the sourness of a tannery somewhere, and the sharp green smell of oil. There is the sound of iron being worked in a periachic village up the road, thin and regular, carrying a long way in still air. There are cicadas in the olive trees, continuous, so constant you stop hearing them, and then notice them again all at once. There are boys somewhere, running, and the voice of a man shouting at them. There is a woman carrying water, and another one talking to her. And there is a line of people out in the fields, bent over, working, who will still be there when the sun goes down. So picture the evening properly now. The light is going long and orange across the plain. Taygetus has gone from grey to rose to a deep blue that is almost black, and it holds the light on its ridge for a while after the valley has lost it. Wood smoke is drifting between the houses. The river sounds louder than it did in the daytime, the way rivers do once everything else goes quiet. From the mess halls comes the low sound of men talking, and occasionally laughing, and further off, someone is singing, and out in the fields, in the dark, other people are still working, and will be working tomorrow, and have no share in any of it. Now let us talk about the women, because on this subject the Spartans genuinely were unlike everyone else, and the rest of Greece found it scandalous. To understand why, you have to know what a respectable woman's life looked like almost everywhere else in the Greek world, and in Athens in particular. In Athens, a woman of citizen family lived under the legal guardianship of a man for her whole life. Her father, then her husband, then perhaps her son. She could not own property beyond her clothes and personal effects, and a limited quantity of goods. She could not make a contract of any size. She was married at 14 or 15, typically to a man twice her age, and she was expected to stay largely within the house, in rooms set aside for the women, and to be spoken about in public as little as possible. Pericles, in the most famous speech ever delivered in that city, told the widows of the war dead that the greatest glory available to them was to be least talked about among men, for praise or for blame. Now come back over the mountains into Laconia. Spartan girls were educated, not identically to the boys, and not away from home, but formally and physically. They ran, they wrestled, they threw the discus and the javelin. They trained in public, in the open, and they competed. The reasoning given by ancient authors was straightforwardly eugenic, that strong mothers bear strong children, and that a woman whose body has been trained will carry and deliver more safely. But whatever the stated reason, the result was a population of women who were physically confident in public space, and the rest of Greece did not know where to look. Athenian comic writers had a name for them, which translates roughly as thigh flashers, on account of the short tunics they trained and ran in. There was a persistent theme in Athenian writing that Spartan women were immodest, ungovernable, and far too visible. Some of that was genuine cultural shock. A good deal of it was politics, because mocking the enemy's women is one of the oldest and least imaginative moves there is. They married later too, at around 18 or 20 rather than 14, to men closer to their own age, which by itself changes the balance of a marriage enormously. The wedding itself was odd, and Plutarch describes it with evident bafflement. The bride's hair was cropped short. She was dressed in a man's cloak and sandals, and left alone in a dark room. The groom, who was still living in barracks, came to her in secret, and left again before dawn to return to his mess. And this went on, according to the tradition, for years, with couples meeting in the dark and by stealth, some of them having children before they had ever seen each other properly in daylight. Whatever else that was, it was not what marriage looked like anywhere else in Greece. And here is the part that genuinely mattered. Spartan women owned land. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century, states that women held around 2/5 of all the territory of Sparta. He is not saying it approvingly. He is saying it as part of an argument that Spartan land tenure was a disaster, that dowries were too large, that heiresses were too numerous, and that wealth was pooling in fewer and fewer hands as a direct consequence. But whether or not you accept his explanation, the fact he reports is extraordinary. In the 4th century before the Common Era, a substantial fraction of the land of a Greek state was in the hands of women who could inherit it, hold it, and pass it on. That gave real economic weight to real people. And you can see the consequences. Around the year 396 before the Common Era, a Spartan woman named Cynisca, the daughter of one king and the sister of another, entered a team in the 4-horse chariot race at the Olympic Games. In that event, the victory belonged to the owner of the team rather than the driver, and Cynisca's team won. Then, 4 years later, it won again. She set up a monument at Olympia, with an inscription declaring that she was the only woman in all of Greece to have taken this crown, and part of that statue base has actually been recovered. This is not a story passed down through admiring biographers. It is a stone. We also catch a few voices. Herodotus gives us Gorgo, the daughter of King Cleomenes, and later the wife of Leonidas. As a small child, he says, she was present when a foreign envoy was trying to bribe her father into a war, and she told her father to get up and leave before the man corrupted him, and her father took the advice. Later, when a warning about the Persian invasion arrived in Sparta, concealed under the wax of a writing tablet, and nobody could work out why a blank tablet had been sent, it was Gorgo who suggested scraping the wax off. There is a much larger collection of sharp remarks attributed to Spartan women, assembled by Plutarch centuries afterwards, and you should treat it as a collection of proverbs rather than as a transcript. The most famous of them has a Spartan woman handing her son his shield and telling him to come back with it or on it, meaning victorious or dead, and carried home upon it. The other, which I think is the better line, has an Athenian woman asking why Spartan women are the only ones who rule their men, and receiving the answer that they are the only ones who give birth to men. We do not know if anyone said either of those things. We do know that later Greeks believed these were the sort of things Spartan women said, and that in itself tells you how they were regarded. Now, the honest counterweight, because this is where a lot of popular accounts stop, and they should not. Spartan women were not free in any sense we would recognize. Their education existed to produce soldiers. Their marriages were arranged with the state's demographic needs in view. So much so that there were arrangements, described with some embarrassment by our sources, in which an older husband might lend his young wife to a younger man for the purpose of producing children, and in which a man might have children by another man's wife, with everyone's agreement. Childlessness was a public problem, not a private sorrow, and motherhood was framed, explicitly, as the female counterpart to military service, the one contribution that justified the citizen's existence. Aristotle, for his part, thought the whole arrangement had failed badly. He accused Spartan women of a lack of discipline, of luxury, and of holding far too much influence over their husbands, and he claimed that when the Theban army finally invaded Laconia, the women of Sparta were more trouble than the enemy, panicking in the streets of a city that had never had to look at a hostile army before. And beneath all of it, always, there is the fact that the freedom of Spartan women rested directly on the unfreedom of Helot women, who worked, who bore children into slavery, who wet-nursed Spartan infants, and who left us not one word. So hold both halves of it. Compared to an Athenian woman, a Spartan woman had a childhood, a body, an education, property, and a voice. Compared to a free person, she had a function. Let your breathing go slow again now. Let the shoulders drop. We are going to walk out onto the plain, in the early morning, and look at the thing all of this was built to produce. The army is forming up. The first thing you would notice is the color, red. A long band of it moving in the half-light because the Spartans went to war in red cloaks. And the practical reason usually given is the least sentimental one imaginable, which is that blood does not show as clearly on red wool. The second thing you would notice is the hair. Spartan men grew their hair long, and before a battle they sat and combed it, carefully, with their armor already on. The story attached to this is that long hair makes a handsome man more striking, and an ugly one more frightening. But the deeper meaning was that they were spending time on their appearance in the last quiet hour before killing, which is about as clear a statement of composure as a man can make. Now the equipment, because it is worth taking slowly. The shield came first, in every sense. It was called the aspis, a round dish of wood roughly 90 centimeters across, faced with a thin layer of bronze, weighing somewhere in the region of 7 or 8 kilograms. It was carried in a way that changed everything. There was a bronze band in the center through which you pushed your forearm, and a grip near the rim which you held with your hand, so the weight rode on the arm rather than dragging from the wrist. That design has one enormous consequence. Because the shield is held on the left arm and is wider than a man, roughly half of it covers you, and roughly half of it hangs out into the space to your left, which is the space occupied by the man next to you. Which means that in a line, every man is partly protected by his neighbor's shield, and every man is protecting the neighbor on his own left, and not one of them can protect himself alone. Everything else about Sparta grows out of that piece of geometry. All the shared meals, all the choirs, all the years in the packs. You cannot run a formation like that on individual courage. You can only run it on the absolute certainty that the man beside you will not move. By the classical period, Spartan shields carried a lambda, the Greek letter L, for Lacedaemon. It is one of the earliest examples in history of a national uniform marking, and it meant that a wall of Spartan shields announced itself before it arrived. Then the helmet. Earlier Spartans wore the full Corinthian type, beaten from a single sheet of bronze, enclosing the whole head with narrow slots for the eyes and a bar down the nose, which protected magnificently and left you nearly deaf and half-blind. By the Peloponnesian War, many had shifted to a simple conical bronze cap called the pylos, open-faced, lighter, far better for hearing orders and seeing the line. Then the body armor, bronze at first, shaped to the muscles of the chest, later often replaced by a lighter composite corselet of layered linen and leather. Then greaves on the shins, bronze, sprung to clip onto the leg. The main weapon was the spear, about 2.5 meters of ash or cornel wood, with an iron head at one end and a bronze spike at the other, which balanced the weapon, let you plant it upright in the ground, and gave you something to fight with if the shaft broke. The sword was the last resort, and the Spartan version was famously short. There is an anecdote about a foreigner mocking the length of a Spartan blade, and receiving the reply that it is long enough if you step closer. Like most of the good Spartan lines, it comes from a late collection and may never have been said. Like most of them, it survives because it is exactly right. Now put them together. The formation was the phalanx, and Sparta did not invent it. Every Greek city fought in a phalanx. What Sparta had was not a secret weapon, it was drill. The Spartan army was divided into units, and those units into smaller units, and those into smaller ones again, each with its own commander, down to a group of about 30 or 40 men. Thucydides, an Athenian who had every reason to be grudging, remarked that in the Spartan army, almost everybody was an officer commanding other officers, and that this was why orders passed so quickly through it. The result was an army that could do things other armies could not. It could change front, it could double its depth, it could wheel, it could countermarch. Ordinary Greek militias, farmers who assembled a few times a year, could walk forwards in a line and push, and that was very nearly the extent of it. Put those two things on the same field, and the difference is not bravery. It is the difference between an orchestra and a crowd singing. There was one more thing, and everybody who saw it remembered it. Other Greek armies charged. They ran the last stretch, screaming, to build up courage and momentum. The Spartans walked. They advanced slowly, in step, to the sound of pipers playing, singing the marching songs of Tyrtaeus, and they did not break into a run. Thucydides, describing the Battle of Mantinea, explains that the pipes were not there for religious reasons, but so that the men would move evenly and keep the line from fragmenting, which is what happens to armies that charge. Try to imagine being on the receiving end. You have worked yourself up, you are shouting, and the red line coming towards you is not shouting, it is singing, quietly, and it is walking, and it is arriving at exactly the same speed it started at. They also did not chase. After breaking an enemy, the Spartans notoriously declined to pursue far, and gave a high-minded reason about not slaughtering men who had already yielded. The practical reason was that pursuit destroys formation, and formation was the entire investment of the entire society. And now, the honesty. The Spartans were not invincible, and the myth that they were has done a lot of damage to how this period is understood. They lost battles. They were poor at sieges for most of their history, and knew it. They had no navy worth the name until Persian gold bought them one. And in 425 before the Common Era, on the island of Sphacteria, an Athenian force cornered a body of Spartans, and, after a fight, 120 Spartiates laid down their arms and surrendered. Greece could not believe it. Someone asked one of the prisoners whether the Spartans who had died were the brave ones, and he answered that an arrow would be worth a great deal if it could pick out the brave, which is the most quietly devastating remark in Thucydides. They were the best soldiers in Greece. They were not something other than soldiers. Keep hold of that, because we are about to walk into the most famous story in ancient warfare, and it is a story where the difference between what happened and what people needed to have happened is very wide indeed. In the year 480, before the Common Era, the king of Persia came to Greece. His name was Xerxes, and he had inherited both an empire and a grievance. His father Darius had sent a force against Greece 10 years earlier, and it had been beaten on the beach at Marathon by the Athenians, which in the scale of Persian affairs was a minor embarrassment on a distant frontier, and in the scale of Greek affairs was the most astonishing thing that had ever happened. Darius had intended to go back and finish it properly. He died first. The task passed to his son. What Xerxes assembled took years, and the preparations alone tell you the size of the ambition. Rather than risk his fleet rounding the stormy cape of Mount Athos, where a Persian fleet had been wrecked before, he had a canal cut straight through the peninsula, wide enough for 2 warships to row abreast, and traces of it can still be detected in the ground today. To move his army out of Asia, he had 2 bridges of boats built across the Hellespont, lashed together with cables of flax and papyrus, and floored with timber and earth, so the animals would walk on it without panicking. When a storm destroyed the first attempt, Herodotus says, the king had the water itself whipped and cursed, which is almost certainly a Greek story about Eastern arrogance rather than a Persian event. But it is a very good story. How many men came with him is one of the oldest arguments in history. Herodotus gives figures running into the millions which no modern historian accepts, because an army of that size drinks rivers dry and cannot be fed by any pre-modern logistics. Estimates today range from perhaps 70,000 to a few 100,000, and honestly, we do not know. What is not in doubt is that it was vastly larger than anything the Greeks could put in the field, and that it came with a fleet alongside it, and that most of the Greek world had already decided to submit rather than fight, because that is the thing usually left out. Most of Greece surrendered. Thessaly went over. Thebes went over. Argos stayed neutral, which given its hatred of Sparta was as good as going over. Delphi, the great oracle, issued prophecies so gloomy that they read as advice to give up. The states that resisted were a minority, and they knew it. Those that did resist met at Corinth and formed an alliance, and they gave the overall command, on land and at sea, to Sparta. The strategy was to find a place where numbers would not count, somewhere so narrow that the Persian army could not deploy, could not outflank, could not use its cavalry, and would have to come at the Greeks a few hundred at a time. They chose the pass at Thermopylae. Let your eyes close and come and stand there with me, because you need to see the ground. You are on the eastern coast of central Greece, at the top of a long gulf. To your left, going up almost immediately, is the mountain wall of Kallidromo, steep, rocky, covered in scrub oak. To your right, in the year 480, is the sea. Between them the ground runs as a shelf, and at 3 points along it, the shelf pinches down to something very tight indeed, at the narrowest, perhaps only wide enough for a single cart track. There are hot springs here. They come up sulphurous and steaming out of the rock, and that is where the name comes from, the Hot Gates. And here is the strange thing about visiting the site today. The sea has gone. The river Spercheios has been dumping silt into that gulf for 2,500 years, and the coastline has moved several kilometers away. What is now a wide flat plain with a main road running across it was, on the day of the battle, a narrow ledge with waves on one side of it. If you go and stand at the modern monument, you are standing in the middle of what was once open water. The battlefield has to be imagined out of the landscape, which is a fair description of this whole subject. There was an old wall across the middle gate, built long before by the Phocians. The Greeks got there first and rebuilt it. Now, the number. Leonidas, one of Sparta's 2 kings, arrived with 300 Spartiates. That figure is real, and it is not the size of the Greek army. The force at Thermopylae was somewhere in the region of 7,000 men, drawn from across those states that had chosen to fight. Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, Locrians, Corinthians, Arcadians, Mantineans, men from Mycenae and Tegea and Phlius. The 300 Spartiates were an elite corps inside a much larger allied army, and every one of those other contingents held the wall as well. So why were there only 300 Spartans? Herodotus gives 2 reasons, and both are entirely characteristic. The Carneia, the great festival of Apollo, was being celebrated, and during it the Spartan army did not march. And the Olympic Games were on, which carried a sacred truce. The 300 were sent as an advance guard, with the intention that the full army would follow once the religious calendar released it. Leonidas, Herodotus adds, deliberately chose men who already had living sons, which is a chilling detail if you follow it through, because it means somebody had already worked out that these particular men might not be coming back. Whether Leonidas went knowing he would die is the question that hangs over everything. Herodotus reports an oracle from Delphi saying that either Sparta would fall or a Spartan king must die, and it is very hard to know whether that prophecy was circulating before the battle or was constructed afterwards to make sense of it. Prophecies have a way of arriving in the record already fulfilled. The fighting began in the high summer heat. For 2 days the Persians attacked, and for 2 days the pass did what the pass was chosen to do. The Persians could only engage on a front a few dozen men wide. Their weapons were built for a different kind of war, wicker shields and shorter spears against a wall of bronze and ash. The Greeks fought in relays, contingent by contingent, rotating fresh men into the line. On the second day, Xerxes sent in his household troops, the 10,000 whom Herodotus calls the Immortals, because their number was always kept exactly full, and they achieved nothing either. Out at sea, at the same time, the Greek fleet was fighting the Persian fleet off Artemisium, and a summer storm was doing more damage to the Persians than the Greeks were. The 2 battles were one operation. The pass was only worth holding while the sea flank was held. It is from these 2 days that we get the best remembered exchange in Greek literature. A man from Trachis told the Spartan Dienekis that the Persian archers were so numerous that their arrows would hide the sun. Dienekis replied that this was excellent news, since it meant they would be fighting in the shade. Let your breath go slow now. This next part goes downhill, and there is nothing you or I can do about it. On the second night, a local man named Ephialtes came into the Persian camp and told them about the path. There was a track over the shoulder of the mountain, the Anopaia, which came out behind the pass. Leonidas had known about it and had posted 1,000 Phocians up there to guard it. The Persians went up in the dark, and the Phocians, hearing movement in the oak leaves at dawn, took up position on the higher ground, expecting to be attacked. The Persians ignored them entirely and simply carried on down the far side, and the path was open. The scouts came in at first light. What Leonidas did next is not the act of a man throwing lives away. He dismissed the army. He sent the great majority of that 7,000 back down the road, out of the trap, to be used another day, and he stayed in the pass with what he had left, because somebody had to hold the Persians long enough for the rest to get clear, and because a Spartan king who abandoned a position was not something that existed. Who stayed with him is important. 700 Thespians stayed, and they were volunteers, from a small city that would be burned to the ground for this, and they were not obliged to remain, and they are the ones history has been most unfair to. Around 400 Thebans were also present, and Herodotus says they were held there against their will and surrendered when it was over. But Herodotus was writing in a period of deep hostility towards Thebes, and many historians treat that passage with suspicion. There were also Helots, in numbers we do not know, who came with the Spartans and stayed with them, and are named nowhere. They fought that morning out in front of the wall, on wider ground, because there was no longer any point in defending a line that had already been turned. Spears broke, and they fought with swords. Swords broke, and Herodotus says they fought with hands and teeth. Leonidas fell somewhere in that, and there was a long struggle over his body, back and forth, and the Greeks got it and pulled it back. At the end, the survivors withdrew to a small rise behind the wall and formed up on it and were shot down with arrows. That hillock is still there, and here is where the archaeology walks in and touches the story, which almost never happens with Sparta. In 1939, the Greek archaeologist Spyridon Marinatos excavated on that mound, and what he found in the soil were large numbers of Persian bronze arrowheads. Not a monument, not an inscription. The actual arrows lying where they landed. Xerxes had the body of Leonidas beheaded and displayed, and Herodotus, who is normally content to let Persian behavior speak for itself, goes out of his way to note that this was a violation of Persian custom, and that Xerxes must have been angrier with this man than with anyone else in the world. Later, the Greeks put up a stone at the pass with a couplet by the poet Simonides. It is 4 lines of nothing at all in Greek, plain to the point of bluntness, and the sense of it is simply this: "Stranger, go and tell the Spartans that we are lying here, obedient to their orders. No glory, no gods, just a message, and a body, and an instruction that was followed." Now let me separate what happened from what was made of it afterwards, because the making began almost immediately. Thermopylae was a defeat. It was not a moral victory that secretly won the war. The pass was lost, the Persians came through, and Athens was evacuated and burned, and its temples on the Acropolis were destroyed. The Persian invasion was actually stopped a few weeks later, in the straits at Salamis, where the Athenian fleet under Themistocles trapped and wrecked the Persian navy in confined water, and then finished the following summer at Plataea, where a Greek army under the Spartan regent Pausanias, containing the largest force of Spartiates ever put in the field, destroyed the Persian land army. Those are the battles that decided it. The 300 were also never 300 alone, and it has taken the modern world an embarrassingly long time to say so clearly. And the slogans attached to the story, the famous reply about coming and taking the weapons, come from collections of sayings assembled centuries later and cannot be traced to the day. So why does it endure? Because of what it is underneath. A small number of people who knew exactly what was going to happen, choosing to stay in a narrow place so that others could get out. That does not require exaggeration to be moving. It has been used since by people who had no business using it, and it was taken up with enthusiasm by regimes in the 20th century who saw in it a fantasy of racial military virtue, and it deserves better than that. What it actually shows is a fairly ordinary thing about human beings, done at an extraordinary scale. People will hold a door, that is all. And 2,500 years later, we are still talking about it. Let the shoulders soften. Let the past go quiet. The sea that used to be there has silted away. The springs are still steaming, and the mountain has not moved at all. Sparta came out of the Persian Wars as the acknowledged leading power of Greece, and the next 70 years are the story of how it lost that position by winning. The trouble started almost at once, and it started with a Spartan abroad. Pausanias, the regent who had commanded at Plataea, was given command of the allied fleet and behaved so badly in the eastern Aegean, dressing in Persian clothes, keeping a Persian bodyguard, insulting allied officers, that the Greek states of the islands and the Asian coast asked Athens to take over the leadership instead. Athens accepted. Pausanias was recalled to Sparta, accused of conspiring with Persia and of intriguing with the Helots, and when they came to arrest him, he took refuge in the temple of Athena of the Bronze House, and the Spartans walled up the doorway and took the roof off and waited, and pulled him out only when he was on the point of death, so that the sanctuary would not be polluted. That single episode contains the whole Spartan problem in miniature. A system that produced extraordinary men at home produced men who came apart in the wider world, because the wider world contained wealth and privacy and flattery, none of which the training had prepared anybody for. Meanwhile, Athens turned its new naval alliance into an empire. Tribute that had been raised to fight Persia went on being raised after Persia was no longer a threat. Cities that tried to leave were besieged and brought back, and the treasury was eventually moved from the sacred island of Delos to Athens itself, where a great deal of it was spent on marble. Sparta had its own alliance, which we call the Peloponnesian League, and which the Spartans themselves called the Lacedaemonians and their allies. It worked differently. Members kept their own governments, paid no tribute, and voted on whether to go to war, but Sparta always commanded, and there was no realistic route out. Corinth, with its money and its ships, was the most important member and the most awkward. Then, in 464 before the Common Era, the ground moved. An enormous earthquake struck Laconia. The ancient accounts are dramatic and probably exaggerated, but the destruction seems to have been severe, and the death toll among Spartiates significant. And the Messenian Helots, seeing the city broken open, rose. They rose in numbers, and they seized the old mountain stronghold of Ithome, and they held it for years. Sparta, which could beat any army in Greece on open ground, could not take a fortified hill, and eventually swallowed its pride and asked its allies for help, including Athens, which had experience of sieges. Athens sent a large force under Cimon, who was personally pro-Spartan and had argued hard for sending it. And then, with the Athenians already there, the Spartans changed their minds and sent them home. Thucydides says plainly why. They had begun to worry that the Athenians, being adventurous and of a different temper, might listen to what the Helots had to say and side with them. You can put your finger on the moment right there. Cimon's political career never recovered. The Athenian assembly took it as a public humiliation, and the two greatest states in Greece began the long slide towards each other. The war, when it came in 431, lasted 27 years. Thucydides, who fought in it and then wrote it, gave a one-line explanation that has been argued over ever since. The truest cause, he said, was the growth of Athenian power and the fear that this produced in Sparta. Everything else was pretext. It was a strange war because the two sides could barely reach each other. Sparta had the finest army in Greece and no way to force a decision against a city with walls down to its harbor and a fleet to feed it. Athens had the finest fleet in Greece and no intention of meeting Spartan infantry in open country. So the Spartans marched into Attica each summer and cut down olive trees, and the Athenians withdrew inside their walls and let them, and sent ships to raid the Peloponnesian coast. What the Athenian strategy did not account for was that packing a whole population inside a walled city is an excellent way to spread disease. In the second year, a plague swept Athens, killing perhaps a quarter or a third of the population, and among the dead was Pericles. The war ground on. There were episodes that shocked Greece: the massacre at Plataea, the debate over Mytilene, the destruction of Melos. There was the disaster at Sphacteria, where Spartans surrendered, and there was one genuinely brilliant Spartan commander, Brasidas, who marched an army all the way to the northern Aegean and took cities by persuasion as much as by force, offering them freedom from Athens, and who was killed winning the Battle of Amphipolis. It is worth noting that Brasidas achieved what he did by being flexible, quick, personally charming, and willing to improvise, which is to say, by being everything the Spartan system was designed to prevent. There was a peace in 421, and it did not hold. Athens then destroyed itself. In 415, it sent an enormous expedition to Sicily to attack Syracuse, a city as large and as democratic as itself. The commander who had promoted the plan, Alcibiades, was recalled to face charges of impiety, defected to Sparta, and advised the Spartans on exactly how to hurt Athens most. 2 years later, the entire Sicilian expedition was annihilated. Fleets, armies, everything. And still, Athens did not fall, because it could build more ships. What finally beat it was money, and the money was Persian. Sparta, the state that had made itself famous for refusing coinage, went to the Persian satraps and made a deal. In exchange for gold to build and man a fleet, Sparta effectively conceded Persian authority over the Greek cities of Asia Minor, the same Greek cities, on the same coast, whose freedom had been the cause of everything since Marathon. With Persian pay, the Spartan admiral Lysander built a navy that could stay at sea. In 405, he caught the Athenian fleet beached and unprepared at Agoge in the Hellespont, and took almost all of it in an afternoon. With the grain route from the Black Sea cut, Athens starved through the winter and surrendered in the spring of 404. The long walls that had made the city unreachable were pulled down, and the sources say it was done to the music of flute girls, with people dancing, believing that this was the beginning of freedom for Greece. It was not. Sparta now ruled, and it ruled badly. Lysander installed narrow oligarchies backed by Spartan garrisons in city after city, and in Athens a regime remembered as the 30 tyrants killed more Athenians in 8 months than the Spartans had in the last 10 years of the war. Spartan governors, the Harmosts, became notorious, and in 387 Sparta signed a settlement with Persia, usually called the King's Peace, which formally handed the Greeks of Asia to the Persian king and gave Sparta a free hand in Greece in return. The liberators had become the thing they had gone to war against in under 20 years. And back home, in the valley, something quieter and far more dangerous was happening. The gold and silver that were not supposed to exist in Sparta had arrived, in quantity, in the baggage of victorious commanders. And the society that had been built to be immune to wealth had no idea what to do about it at all. There is a word in Greek for what happened to Sparta next: oliganthropia. It means, roughly, a shortage of men, and it is the quietest catastrophe in ancient history, because nobody was killed in it, and it killed the city anyway. Here are the numbers, and I want to give them to you slowly, because the shape of them is the whole story. At Plataea, in 479, Herodotus says, Sparta put 5,000 full Spartiate citizens into the field, and that was not all of them, because men were left at home. At Leuctra, 108 years later, the total number of Spartiates present on the battlefield was somewhere around 700. By the time Aristotle sat down to analyze the problem, in the middle of the 4th century, he reckoned the Spartan citizen body had fallen below 1,000, and he pointed out something devastating. The land of Laconia, he said, could support 1,500 cavalry and 30,000 heavy infantry. The territory was not the problem. There was more than enough of it. There were simply almost no citizens left to hold it. So where did they go? Not into the ground. Some, certainly. The earthquake of 464 killed a great many. 27 years of war killed more, and the wars after it more again. And every generation the pool of men eligible to father the next generation was a little smaller. But the real mechanism was economic, and it ran through that trapdoor I mentioned earlier. Remember the rule. Every citizen had to deliver a fixed monthly contribution to his common mess, out of the produce of his allotment. Fail to deliver it, and you were expelled from the mess. Expelled from the mess, you ceased to be one of the equals. There was a name for men in that position, hypomyones, the inferiors, and once you were one, your sons would be too. Now add wealth to that system, and watch what it does. Land, over generations, does what land always does. It concentrates. Estates were inherited, split, married together, mortgaged. Daughters carried land into other families as dowries, and Aristotle complains bitterly that the dowries were enormous, and that heiresses were multiplying, and that a huge proportion of Laconia had ended up in the hands of a small number of very rich people, many of them women. Plutarch mentions a law, attributed to a man called Epitideius, which supposedly allowed a Spartan for the first time to give away or bequeath his allotment freely. Historians argue about whether Epitideius existed and about when the change actually happened, and the honest answer is that the mechanism is clear even where the legislation is not, and the money that came home from the victory over Athens poured accelerant on all of it. Sparta had spent 4 centuries constructing a society that could not be bought, and then it won an empire, and the empire paid in silver. The result was a state in which a shrinking elite owned nearly everything. A growing mass of men were technically Spartan and legally nothing, and the army had to be filled out with people who were not citizens at all. Freed helots, enrolled as soldiers under the name Neodemodes. Perioikoi, in ever greater proportion. Boys of irregular birth who had been put through the training as companions to wealthier children. And in the year 399, before the Common Era, somebody said out loud what all of this meant. His name was Cynodon. He was not a citizen, he was one of the inferiors, and he was plotting a rising. Xenophon tells us that when the authorities got hold of the man who informed on him, they asked how Cynodon had made his case, and the answer was this. Cynodon had taken him to the edge of the marketplace and told him to count the true Spartiates present. They counted around 40 out of perhaps 4,000 people standing in the square. And Cynodon said that as for the rest, the helots, the inferiors, the freedmen, there was not one of them who would not gladly eat a Spartiate raw. 40 out of 4,000. In their own marketplace, in the heart of their own city. The conspiracy was broken, and Cynodon was tortured and killed. But you cannot arrest arithmetic. Let your breathing slow here. Let the shoulders drop. Nothing in this next part is going to be dramatic. It is just going to arrive. The man in charge for most of this period was Agesilaus of the Eurypontid house, who reigned for over 40 years, and who was, by every account including Xenophon's admiring one, brave, plain living, personally incorruptible, and completely committed to the old ideal. He was also lame from birth, which had nearly cost him the throne, and he campaigned in Asia against Persia, with real success, before being recalled to deal with a war at home. And under him, Sparta made enemies of everyone. Thebes, Athens, Corinth and Argos all ended up fighting against it. The king's peace brought a pause by selling Greek cities to Persia, and in 382, a Spartan commander marching past Thebes seized its citadel in peacetime, without orders, and installed a garrison. Even Xenophon, who loved Sparta and loved Agesilaus, treats this as the act for which the gods eventually punished them. The Thebans threw the garrison out 3 years later, and then they did something far worse. They started thinking about how to beat the phalanx. The men who did it were Epaminondas and Pelopidas, and what they built was a professional corps called the Sacred Band, 300 picked men, and a way of using it. Here is the problem they solved. Greek armies traditionally put their best troops on the right wing, and lines were usually 8 ranks deep across the whole front, and battles were decided when one right wing beat the enemy's left. Everybody knew this. Everybody did it. At Leuctra in 371, Epaminondas did not do it. He put his best troops on the left, opposite the Spartan king and the Spartan elite, and he stacked them 50 ranks deep. Then he advanced that wing forward at an angle and held the rest of his line back, so that his mass hit the Spartan right before the two armies had properly met anywhere else. 50 ranks against 12. The finest infantry in Greece were simply pushed off the field by weight. King Cleombrotus was killed. Of the 700 Spartiates on that field, 400 died in an afternoon. and that was very close to the entire remaining military manpower of the city. The way Sparta received the news is one of the most extraordinary passages Xenophon ever wrote, and I want to give it to you carefully. The messenger arrived on the last day of the Gymnopediae, the summer festival, with the choruses actually dancing in the square. The ephors heard the casualty list. They did not stop the festival. They notified the families of the dead, told the chorus to continue, and let the dancing finish. And the next morning, Xenophon says, you could see it in the streets. The relatives of the men who had been killed went about in public looking bright and cheerful. The relatives of the men who had survived were barely to be seen, and those who did appear went about looking humiliated and low. Whatever you think of that society, look at what it had achieved. It had made bereavement into status and survival into shame, and it held that even in the moment of its own destruction. 2 years later, Epaminondas came down into the valley. It had been 600 years, according to Plutarch, since an enemy army had been seen in Laconia. There were no walls. The women of Sparta, Aristotle says, who had lived their whole lives on the assurance that this could never happen, saw the smoke of burning villages from their own doorways, and could not cope with it, and were more disorder to the city than the invaders were. Agesilaus, old by now, refused to be drawn into open battle, held the town with what he had, and Epaminondas eventually withdrew without taking it. But Epaminondas had not come for Sparta. He had come for the thing underneath Sparta. He crossed Taygetus into Messenia, and he gave it back. He called the Messenians home, from exile, all over the Mediterranean, from Sicily and North Africa, and wherever else the last 4 centuries had scattered them, and he founded a new capital for them on the slopes of Mount Ithome, and he built it walls. You can still walk those walls. The circuit at ancient Messene runs for something like 9 kilometers, with towers and gates, and the Great Arcadian Gate is one of the finest pieces of Greek military architecture anywhere. That city was built, deliberately and permanently, on the site where the Helots had made their last stands, by an enemy who had understood exactly what Sparta was. Because with Messenia gone, roughly half the agricultural base of Sparta was gone, and with it, the labor that had made the entire system possible. The Spartan citizen had been able to spend his life training because other people grew his food. Now a great many of those people had their own country back, and their own walls, and no intention of ever returning. Sparta was not destroyed at Leuctra. It was simply, from that day, a small regional power in the southern Peloponnese, with a magnificent reputation and almost nothing behind it. It kept the reputation, though, and it kept the pride, which produced one of the best exchanges in ancient history. When Philip of Macedon had conquered Greece and was demanding submission, he sent a message asking whether he should come as a friend or an enemy, and adding that if he entered Laconia, he would raze the city to the ground. The Spartans replied with a single word: if. He left them alone. So later did his son Alexander, who was busy elsewhere, and evidently decided that this particular relic was not worth the trouble. There were 2 last attempts to fix it, and they are more moving than they usually get credit for. In the 3rd century, 2 kings in succession, Agis and then Cleomenes, tried to rebuild the old system from the ground up, cancel debts, redistribute the land, enroll new citizens from the Perioikoi and beyond, restart the training. Agis was arrested and strangled in prison for it. Cleomenes actually managed it, briefly, and fought well, and was finally beaten at Salacia just north of Sparta in 222, and died in exile in Egypt. And then the Romans arrived. Let the eyes rest now. Let the breath go long. What follows is the strangest chapter of all, and it is a slow one. Rome came into Greece gradually, as an arbitrator, then as a patron, then as an owner. Sparta's last independent ruler, a king named Nabis, held out and maneuvered, and was eventually killed, and in 146, before the Common Era, after the Romans destroyed Corinth, Greece became Roman in fact. And here is the peculiar thing. Sparta did rather well out of it. The Romans were fascinated by Sparta. They had grown up on the same books we have, on Plutarch's sources and Xenophon and Plato, and they held the Spartan constitution up as one of the great achievements of the ancient world. Rome granted the city privileged status as a free city, exempt from certain forms of interference. Emperors visited. Hadrian, who loved Greece more than any of them, showed it particular favor. But the Sparta they were honoring did not exist anymore, and everybody involved knew it. And so Sparta did the only reasonable thing available. It became a theme park of itself. The old training system was revived, or rather reconstructed, as a self-conscious antiquarian exercise. Local antiquarians assembled it out of books and traditions. Wealthy families put their sons through it for prestige. Titles were resurrected, ceremonies restored, archaic dialect used in inscriptions. And at the center of the whole operation was the whipping. You remember the ritual at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, where boys tried to steal cheeses from the altar, past a line of older youths with whips. In the classical period, this was a rough contest, one rite among many, and nobody much wrote about it. Under Rome, it became the main attraction. It was reworked into a straightforward endurance ordeal. Boys were flogged at the altar, and the point was no longer to seize anything, but to see how long a boy could take it without crying out. The winner was honored with a title, and sometimes with a monument, and it was performed for spectators. Roman visitors came from a long way to watch it. Cicero saw it. Later writers report boys dying under the lash, and their families regarding this as a fine thing. And then, in the 3rd century of the Common Era, they built a theater, an actual stone amphitheater, constructed around the ancient altar so that the audience could see properly. The foundations of it were excavated by British archaeologists at the beginning of the 20th century, and they are still there, wrapped around a sanctuary that had been in use since the 9th century before the Common Era. Sit with that image for a moment, because it is the most complete symbol this story has to offer. A society that had once trained boys in secret, in the hills, for war it expected to fight, ended up flogging boys in a purpose-built arena for the entertainment of foreign tourists, and calling it tradition. Nothing was being defended anymore. It was a performance of a memory of a thing. The scholar and travel writer Pausanias came through in the 2nd century of the Common Era and left a description of the town, and it reads exactly like a guidebook. Here is the tomb they say is Leonidas. Here is the shrine of Lycurgus, whom they worship as a god. Here is the place where such and such happened. He is careful, he is interested, and there is a very faint air throughout of a man visiting a well-kept ruin. The end came the way it came for most of the Greek world. Raiders out of the north in the 3rd century, Alaric and the Goths at the end of the 4th, earthquakes, decline, and in the 13th century, when the region needed a defensible center, it was not rebuilt at Sparta at all. A fortress town called Mistras was raised on a spur of Taygetus, a few kilometers away, tall and steep and easy to hold, and everything moved there, and old Sparta was left as fields. For roughly 500 years there was no city in that place. Farmers worked over the top of it. The modern town of Sparta was laid out and founded in 1834 by decree of the first king of the new Greek state, on the site, on purpose, for the name. So that is the whole arc, a scatter of villages in a river valley, an unwalled city, an army that walked to the sound of pipes, an empire won and squandered inside a generation, a slow bleeding away of the people who were supposed to hold it, and finally, a tourist attraction with an amphitheater round it. Which leaves the last question, and it is the interesting one. Why are we still here, in the dark, talking about them? Let your breathing go slow and easy now. Let the pillow take the full weight of your head. Nothing that follows needs to be held on to. Start with a problem that has been sitting underneath this entire documentary. No Spartan ever wrote about Sparta. Think about that. There is no Spartan history of the Peloponnesian War, no Spartan philosophy, no Spartan constitution written by a Spartan, no memoir by a man who went through the training, not one letter home. After the 7th century, when Alcman was writing his choral songs, the city that produced the most discussed society in the ancient world produced almost no literature at all, and that was deliberate, because writing things down was not what they valued. So everything we have is from outside. Herodotus, a Greek from Asia Minor, collecting stories a generation or two after the events. Thucydides, an Athenian, exiled, meticulous, and permanently interested in power. Xenophon, an Athenian who fell in love with Sparta, was exiled from his own city, was given an estate by the Spartans, and sent his sons through the Spartan upbringing, and who wrote about it the way a convert writes about a faith. Plato, who was fascinated. Aristotle, who was critical and precise, and probably closest to the truth. Plutarch, warm and wonderful, and writing 7 centuries later, a biographer and moralist rather than a historian, and the source of most of the anecdotes everyone knows. Not one of them was a Spartan. Several of them were producing arguments about their own cities, using Sparta as their counterexample. When Athenian aristocrats grumbled about democracy, they grew their hair long and praised Spartan discipline, and other Athenians had a mocking word for them, the laconizers. There is a term for what this produced, coined by the French scholar François Ollier in the 1930s, the Spartan mirage. The idea that what we have is not Sparta but an image of Sparta, assembled by admirers and enemies for their own purposes, and that the real place is somewhere behind it and largely out of reach. Almost everything you have ever heard about Sparta passes through that mirage, including a great deal of what I have told you tonight, which is why I have kept naming the sources as we went. And yet the mirage is itself one of the most influential objects in the history of European thought. Plato built the ideal city of the Republic out of pieces of it. Children raised in common by the state, a guardian class kept from private wealth, poetry censored for its effect on the young, marriages arranged for the quality of the offspring. Read the Republic with Sparta in your head, and it stops being a thought experiment and starts being a redesign. The historian Polybius, writing for a Roman audience, worked out from Sparta the theory of the mixed constitution, that a state survives by balancing monarchy, aristocracy, and popular power against one another, so that no single element can run away with it. That idea went into Cicero, and out of Cicero into Machiavelli, and out of Machiavelli into Montesquieu, and from Montesquieu into the arguments of the 18th century about how to construct a republic that would not decay. When men in Philadelphia sat and argued about separation of powers, they were, at several removes, arguing about a council of 28 old men in a Greek valley. Rousseau loved Sparta and disliked Athens, and said so, and the French revolutionaries who read him took it up with enthusiasm. Saint Just and others reached for Sparta constantly. Austere, virtuous, incorruptible. Everything the old regime was not. One of the American founders wished aloud that Boston might become a Christian Sparta. And then the 20th century did the thing the 20th century did. Sparta was taken up by the German far right and by the Nazi state as a model, held up as the first genuinely racial society, a warrior people who had kept themselves pure and disposed of the unfit. The story of infant inspection at the foot of Taygetus, the one that is least well supported in the sources, was quoted with approval in support of eugenic policy. Hitler praised the Spartans directly. It is worth being blunt about this, because it is part of the legacy whether we like it or not. Sparta is unusually easy to weaponize. A society with almost no surviving voice of its own is a society you can fill up with whatever you have brought with you, and that has not stopped. In our own time, Sparta lives mostly through a comic book and the film made from it, which gave a great many people their only picture of the place, and which is magnificent to look at, and almost entirely fiction. It shows 300 men alone, when there were thousands. It shows Sparta as the free society opposing Eastern tyranny, which requires you not to think about the helots for 2 hours. The slogans have been picked up by political movements the actual Spartans would have found baffling, and underneath the noise, the language keeps their name anyway. When you call a room Spartan, you are describing a house with a ceiling finished by an axe. When you call a remark laconic, you are naming a valley. So let me leave you with the myths, gently, one at a time, in case any of them are still sitting in your head as we go towards the end of the night. There were never 300 alone. There were around 7,000 at the pass for 2 days, and at least 1,100 who stayed on the last morning, and helots whose names nobody recorded. They were not invincible. They lost. They surrendered on Sphacteria. They were broken at Leuctra by a better general. They were not enemies of art. In the 7th century they were one of the musical capitals of Greece, and their soldiers sang poetry as they walked into battle, and their girls' choirs were famous. They did not systematically throw weak infants off a mountain, as far as we can tell. That comes to us from one source, 700 years later, unmentioned by earlier writers who had every reason to mention it, and the bones in the chasm turned out to belong to grown men. And they were not a modern totalitarian state, whatever the surface resemblances. They had no ideology in our sense, no scripture, no program of world transformation. They were, if anything, deeply and anxiously conservative, a small population holding down a much larger one, and terrified of change. And every strange thing they did makes sense the moment you put the helots back into the picture, which is precisely what most tellings leave out. So why does it hold us? I think it is because Sparta is the closest thing history offers to a completed experiment. Most societies are compromises. They want several things at once. They change their minds. They drift. Sparta, or at least the Sparta of the Mirage, decided what it valued, and then subordinated everything else to it, without apology and without exception. Family, wealth, comfort, privacy, art, trade, childhood, all of it bent towards one outcome, and we get to see the entire arc, from the founding to the theme park. We get to see what that bought them, which was 3 centuries of stability and the finest infantry in the world, and we get to see what it cost, which was everything, and we get to see that the very design that produced the strength was what produced the collapse. The land system that made a man free to train was the land system that concentrated the land and starved the citizen body out of existence. The fear of the helots that made them disciplined was the fear that made them unable to change. There was no separate failure. The failure was the success, running long enough. That is a genuinely uncomfortable thing to look at, because every society is doing a smaller version of the same trade, ours included. We are all optimizing for something, and the bill for it usually arrives several generations after the people who set it up are dead. And then there is the simpler pull, which is that from a distance they are beautiful. A line of men in red who walk instead of run. A boy holding a hand out to hide the fact that he is starving. A woman handing over a shield. A king combing his hair on the last morning of his life. That has aesthetic force, and it always will, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Just remember, when you feel that pull, that you are looking at the citizens. There were never very many of them, and there were a great many other people in that valley, working in the dark, who left nothing behind at all, and who are the reason any of it was possible. Let the eyes stay closed now. Let the jaw be loose. Let the hands be heavy. We are nearly at the end. Come back to the valley one last time. It is morning again. Not 3,000 years ago. This morning, the mountain is exactly where it was. Taygetus, running north and south, grey and rose in the early light, with snow in the high folds. Nothing about it has altered in the whole of this story. It was there before the Mycenaeans. It was there when the boys went up its slopes with their dogs. It was there when Epaminondas crossed it to give Messenia back, and it is there now. Below it, the plain is full of olive trees. Kilometer after kilometer of them, silver grey, moving slightly, catching the light on their undersides the way they have always done. The Eurotas is running, lower than it used to, in the dry months, threading down the middle of the valley towards the sea. There is a town there, laid out in straight modern streets, with a main avenue and cafes and school children. It has been there for less than 200 years, and of the city that this whole night has been about, there is almost nothing. A theatre cut into a hillside, its stone mostly carried off long ago to build other things. The outline of a sanctuary by the river, with the foundations of a Roman amphitheatre wrapped around it. A scattering of walls, a small museum with some remarkable things in it, and a great many gaps. Up on the shoulder of the mountain, a few kilometers away, the beautiful ruined Byzantine town of Maestras, which is far better preserved than Sparta ever was, and which is not Sparta at all. Thucydides was right. He said that a future generation would look at the remains of this place and find it very hard to believe that it had ever been what the stories claimed. And that is precisely what happens. You stand in the middle of it, and you have to take the whole thing on trust. There is something worth sitting with in that. They built the most severe society in the ancient world, and they built it to last, and they were more successful at that than almost anyone. And what survived was not the walls, because they refused to build any, and not the buildings, because they thought fine buildings were a weakness. What survived was the story, words written down by outsiders in other cities, by people who were often their enemies. Every civilization ends, all of them, the ones that thought about it and the ones that never considered the possibility. The valley outlasts the city, the mountain outlasts the valley, and eventually there is a quiet field with olive trees in it where something enormous used to stand. And then, long afterwards, somebody lies in the dark on the other side of the world and listens to the whole thing from beginning to end. And for an hour or two, those people are not entirely gone. That is the only immortality anybody actually gets. It is not nothing. The light is coming down the face of the mountain now, in that long, slow line, the way water moves down a wall. The river is running, the olive leaves are turning over, and you can let all of it go. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I truly appreciate every single one of you who spends part of your evening here on Sleep into Power. Whether you made it all the way to these final words or fell asleep somewhere back in the Bronze Age, thank you for being here. If you enjoyed this documentary, please do subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you would think, and it means these long ones can keep being made. My book is linked below, if you would like something to read in the daylight hours. This documentary is also available on Spotify and on all the major podcast platforms, if you would rather listen without a screen. And Buy Me a Coffee is linked below as well, for anyone who feels like supporting the channel. There is absolutely no obligation. Listening is support enough. If there is a subject you would like to fall asleep to next, leave it in the comments. I read them, and a great many of these documentaries have started life as somebody's suggestion at 2 in the morning. Now let the mountain go. Let the river go. Let the whole valley drift out of focus and away. Rest well. Sleep into power, guys. Good night.